the lockdown. Long live the lockdown.
I'm loving it, lads, to be honest.
I tell you what, I'm getting used to it.
That's the problem. How do we go back to working 15-hour days?
I don't know. It's going to be interesting, isn't it? It's going to be interesting to see how people adapt back into the rat race.
I don't think the world can go and smoothly transition back to the way it was. I think people have to ask questions like, what happens if companies find that their staff are just as productive working at home?
Probably more productive.
More productive.
And, there's definitely going to be an element of that, or even just the thing of, well, they're a little less productive, but you know what? We don't have to spend, $500,000 a year on offices.
Exactly.
True.
It's like, okay, we have to hire a few more staff, but we can save a few quid on this.
Yeah, it's interesting. It's really interesting, and it goes to show you how weak the economic model that we're using is. When we have to take a step back from it. Look, I mean, we're going to head into some sort of economic depression now. And it's interesting that some of the interventions that have been put in place by the government, they're fundamentally based on what could be termed as socialist principles, I suppose, and how they're probably a little bit more robust in times like this, and how they're a little bit more people-centered. But yeah, it'll be interesting. It'll be really interesting. I don't think that hamster wheel is going to speed back up to the way it was.
There's definitely going to be changes that will change how we live our lives forever. Like revolutions back in the day, but it's going to be strange because obviously they took years and years to happen, and this is going to happen in a few months. So
yeah, that's an interesting point. Yeah,
there's going to be changes there for sure. Do
you know what? An interesting one, and this is a kind of a summation of a few thoughts. But like I was listening to a guy. He does a hardcore history podcast, and he does another one. It's a kind of an American political commentary, but he hasn't done anything since Trump got elected. He just feels like I can't offer anything of value here. Dan Carlin. But one of the things he was saying is that what we don't probably realize right now is we're in another one of those great iconic moments, but we can't realize it because we think everything is moving very fast and we're living in it. But if you came through the Industrial Revolution, that was 150 years. If you came through the Iron, or not so much Iron Age, but like the Renaissance, any of the major kind of the Age of Exploration, whatever.
Yeah.
The world fundamentally changed in all of its base principles, how life was organized, how life was lived. All of this just changed fundamentally. Now we look back on it and it seems like 150 years, that was a very long time. Everyone probably just adapted. It was probably fine. But at the time, it probably felt like it was explosively fast, like everyone was struggling to keep up. I mean, I think that's like, in 100 years, they might look back at this and talk about the information age or the communications age or whatever it happens to be. And it maybe it lasts 50 years. But like maybe it started with television, and it ends at some point in the future. But like this bit in the middle of it here, where we're sitting looking at a pandemic, exposes everything we thought we'd moved past as a globalized society. And we're going. It's scary.
It's like you said there, globalized society as well. Like you can notice that everything is coming a bit more nationalist, and everyone's just worried about their own country. Nobody's really giving it any like worries about the States or Europe or anything right now compared to what it was a few weeks ago.
The more threat someone feels under, the closer they look in their circle. So they like the most threatened a person can be is when they turn in on even on their family and only worry about themselves. But it comes like that. It's so tribal. It's like, well, cooperation and all that is wonderful until we're threatened. Now it's about my tribe. It's my tribe. Okay, sorry, I don't have time or energy to focus on you. Then my tribe becomes my family. My family becomes me. So
it's interesting.
We're not honourable when it comes to that. That takes a whole different degree of principle.
Absolutely right. Yeah, absolutely right. We should have this conversation again in 10 years' time and looking back.
There we go.
See where we're all at.
We crack on and talk a bit of fighting.
Where do you want to start?
Yeah, I just for that one, I'm wearing the T-shirt of the championship that never happened, Euro 2020.
Oh, no. How did you get the T-shirt? You're obviously in the know there.
We were nearly on the way. No, this is the team, the supporter shirt for the team traveling. So this would be the one that the parents and the families and friends and all that would buy. And, so obviously they're not much use now. So
it's disappointing for everybody. Obviously across the world of sport, it's been it's been a real kick. Yeah.
Yeah. What a level.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, you feel for the athletes, particularly those athletes that were preparing for high-level championships like Worlds or Europeans or even the Olympic Games.
Olympics, yeah.
Yeah, to have that kind of dangling in front of you and then to have it taken away from you in the blink of an eye nearly must be tough. Like we've an athlete in canoeing, obviously, who qualified for the games, and he was in between camps going to Tokyo. So really getting into the flow of things and getting prepared physically and mentally, and then it was just boom, no, you're stopped. And he's based in France, where the lockdown was much stricter well before our kind of lockdown restrictions started to get a little bit tighter, where you couldn't go out at all unless you were just going to the shops or you had a medical emergency to attend to. So yeah, so it's tough across the board for sure. Unusual times.
Exactly. Jon, we know you very well, but maybe just for the listeners, in case anyone hasn't come across Jon Mackey yet, do you want to give yourself a little brief introduction there?
Oh, yeah, sure. I'll keep it as brief as possible. Jon Mackey is my name. Hello. And I started in Taekwondo in 1987 with the Irish School of Taekwondo. Started in Kempo previously the year before for a little while, and moved into the Taekwondo club when it moved into my area. So I started when I was 9, going on 10. And I've been involved ever since in one way, shape or form. Opened my own club in Cabra in 2004. Was predominantly an ITF club. Joined the ITF actually. I wasn't brought up in the ITF system, but I joined the ITF in 2004 because there was a little bit more variability because the split had happened in 2001, I think. So there was a lot of options. Yeah, 2002.
1, 2, yeah.
Yeah, so there was a lot of options within Ireland at that stage, and obviously recruitment was big, and associations were trying to get members. So I joined one of the ITFs and got into the system and really enjoyed it. But always kind of dabbled with kickboxing at the same time. It was because I was brought up, I suppose, that way. Our club, our Taekwondo club, competed a lot at the old Akoi tournaments and the kind of the multi-discipline tournaments. So I joined Akoi as it was in 2005, and then slowly kind of progressed the wrong word, but slowly moved from Taekwondo into kickboxing and kind of fully into kickboxing maybe over the last 3 or 4 years. So no longer doing Taekwondo, alas, but I'll always be a Taekwondo student at heart. So that's me. I'm currently studying a master's degree in coaching and performance science in UCD. So looking forward to having a chat with you guys. A couple of legends.
No, definitely looking forward to it now.
Cool. Yeah. Cool.
Just on the transition, Jon, what was one of the main things that you noticed between the transition from Taekwondo to kickboxing?
In terms of the performance element, Richie, intensity, I think, would be one. Intensity, culture, and the environment of the competitions, that the environment that competitions are held in. So, as you know, Taekwondo competitions are they're very formal. There's a nice feel to it. You've got that kind of that martial art element of it. But with kickboxing tournaments, it's very much about the sport and very much about the performance. So. Your first time to a kickboxing tournament and it has been said to me by parents at the time when we started bringing the kids to kickboxing tournaments, that the environment was aggressive. And it's a little bit like going to a football match, I suppose, where you've got supporters shouting in from the side and all of that. And it's just a very different environment. But the sport itself, I suppose, just because the rings are that bit smaller, is a little bit more intense. And there's a focus, obviously there's a strong focus on the boxing elements that are in Taekwondo, but not so much. I suppose the kickboxing end of things would be a lot more aligned with traditional boxing methods. So they were the things that we had to try and get our head around. And when we started competing first, my own club with Akoi as it was, it's Kickboxing Ireland now, we competed in our do box. So we went with our ITF do box to the tournaments. So I suppose we had a little bit of a target on our back, who are these guys coming into the kickboxing world with their traditional low box on. It was all kind of friendly rivalry, there was no malice in any of it. But we certainly had to kind of adapt to our, move away from our kind of our lead leg style, because good kickboxers know how to take that range away from you. So as a lead leg fighter, you need that bit of distance. The extra size of the ring is obviously going to be beneficial to that. So when you've got someone who's constantly squeezing into your space and knowing that you're going to lift that lead leg at some stage and kind of counter you and then stay on top of you. So the rules obviously in kickboxing allow that to happen, that kind of close to medium range combinations to score and to take place. So to be honest, it didn't take long. Like I've a little bit of a background in boxing, did a bit of boxing as a kid. I coached in our boxing club. So it didn't take long, to be fair, to transition over. And within a couple of years, actually, we were starting to make an impact on the international team. And Lauren went from winning the ITF European Championships with the North Korean ITF in Bulgaria in 2011 to winning the WAKO European Championships in 2013 as a junior. So that was kind of, I suppose you could say, it was kind of validation of what we were doing in terms of the direction we were going with our sport.
Obviously, like something that I know is big time is the stance change. Obviously, you can't be really side on facing in kickboxing.
No. Yeah.
Because that brings in a bit more boxing in, of course, with the difference in points as well. I suppose one kick, was it 1 point for a body kick, isn't it?
Yes, it is indeed.
Yeah, I suppose that does make a change as well, you know.
Yeah, and you're right, Richie. The backhand is a crucial scoring technique in kickboxing, and more so than the jab. A little bit different in boxing, where there's a lot of emphasis on the jab and a lot of scores behind the jab. But in kickboxing, there's a lot of emphasis on a clean cross, so a punch from the back. So you're right. If you're side facing, you've kind of negated the ability to do that. And you know, somebody with an element of tactical experience will know that and will expose that and will constantly keep moving to your backside all the time. So you're totally tied up to where they're going to attack you on the flank. So yeah, there's a little bit of variation in terms of the standing position, relevant, I suppose, to the scoring techniques of the sport. Yeah,
definitely. I think though people that have a nice combination of both, they're quite successful. Like, you know, I think they both complement each other really well, and if you can find that nice blend. You know what I mean? There's likes of Alameen there and people like that who have a nice blend of both, and they're doing really well, like, you know.
100%. And I think it boils down to the ability to switch when you need to switch. But some people just, because of how they've been brought up in their training style, just can't switch. They're ingrained into that full-on side-facing position. And in light contact or continuous kickboxing, that's a dangerous place to be. In point fighting, not so much because you're relying on that kind of that fast, explosive one-score technique, which might be off your front leg. So, yeah, you're right. No, good observation.
Yeah, it's definitely a little bit of exchange that's been going on over the last few years. You know, people will learn from their environment, and you know, the people who've cross-trained into kickboxing or from kickboxing cross-trained into Taekwondo, there's definitely, or even, you know, from the ones who've come over even without other people crossing back, there's a cross-training and a sharing that's going on and a learning from the other styles. But that's been happening forever. I mean, you know, you go back to the 80s, and the Dutch were doing a great job in the late 80s, early 90s of borrowing the back kick and the cut 45 turning kick from WTF. And, you know, I think people will always do that. And even you go back to some of the early innovations in point karate, you know, the full contact point karate from the 60s and 70s. And, you know, an awful lot of the basics of what what tatami sport would look like come from that era.
Yeah,
you know, the advent of protective equipment. You know.
Yeah, exactly. No, it's a great point. And then obviously you've got Thomas Barada, who was kind of the pioneer in that crossing over from ITF Taekwondo into kickboxing. And I think when he brought that style and that kind of very ITF style and working off the front leg and being able to pull switch back kicks out of his back pocket and stuff and catch people who were very full on or very square facing in that old traditional style, kind of revolutionized the sport, and obviously then made it attractive for other people to move over from Taekwondo or from ITF in particular. And I think that's been good for kickboxing. I think kickboxing has been influenced a lot by lots of different combat sports, but in particular ITF Taekwondo, and that stamp is still there. You know, that stamp, that influence that Barada brought to it is still there. It's very evident to today.
Yeah, and you can certainly see the same going the other way back into ITF ring sport at the moment, where, you know, you can definitely see in particular techniques and styles and strategies that would have been successful both in points and continuous in kickboxing that are translating in a little bit.
Yeah, for sure.
But we were going to start the conversation a little bit today as well on a topic that's just been bounced over and back, which was the talent identification, talent development, nurturing, and the concept of deliberate practice and 10,000 hours and the whole lot of it. So rather than just firing one question out there, do you want to give us the kind of the genesis of where that.
Why not? Yeah, let's. Let me see. Where will we start? It's a huge area of discussion, and has been for the last 20, 25 years, maybe 30 years, maybe. But it's one of the most interesting because of the variety of opinion relating to that subject. And it's a great question to start with is what is talent? What is talent? What is talent to you, Adrian?
Yeah, I mean, I'm on record already. One of the things that I've definitely said before, again and again and again, is that there is nothing that I've ever seen in a young competitor up to the age of 11, 12, 13 that I would consider tells me, yeah, that person is going to make
Absolutely.
it. I've not seen much in terms of early predictors of success. Like the closest things that I could talk about, you might as well look and see, are their parents tall? Right. Yeah. Good. Talented. Well done. Fair play to you. It's like the old phrase of, if you want to win the Olympics, you have to pick your parents very carefully. Genetics.
And your country of birth.
Yeah. Well, this is the whole thing. I mean, will you have the economic opportunities to train, travel, and all the rest of it? The opportunity is as important as anything else.
100%.
The backing and support of your family and your community is going to be hugely important.
Yeah.
You could come into ITF Taekwondo in Ireland, and if you happen to be, and again, without any intended slight towards any instructor, but if you land in Kilkenny, we don't have an awful lot of people who've established successful clubs and gone on push people onto the national team. You could be in Cork and you just go to the one that's the other side of the road that's closer to you and has no competitive focus whatsoever, and that could be perfect for you at depending on how you go.
Absolutely.
So there's so many variables in that. So for me, really what I'm thinking of is the determinants of future success, and I don't know if you relate to them as talent, is number one, being there after about 10, 12 years when you turn 18. So getting to an adulthood, to a mature stage of development within a sport with sufficient skills to actually be able to continue to enjoy the sport, set realistic and challenging goals, and put yourself on a performance pathway. Injury resilient enough to actually sustain the training, psychologically motivated enough and together enough to be able to engage with that, and then making sure that you have actually got the financial resources support network. There's so many things in it.
And when you boil it right down, it's really interesting that a lot of it stems from circumstances, just random circumstances. Like you said, crossing the road to join a particular type of club, and a club that happens to be affiliated to a governing body who's affiliated to a national or to an international federation. So within that, there's a pathway or an opportunity to international sport. But again, within that, you need to be in a club where the environment is kind of engaged in that. So your coach is up to speed on the knowledge needed to be able to develop, I suppose, over a long stage or a long period of time, athletes with the ability to compete at that level. But for me, I think talent is a combination of two things. It's everything that you said there, which can be maybe termed as those psychological characteristics for developing excellence. And then you've got the physical qualities as well. So those physical qualities that may be handed down from your parents or your grandparents. For combat sport, for example, especially the striking sports, a little bit of height and a bit of reach is always going to be advantageous. And you could do kind of a sample kind of test across the world and European championships at the champions at the moment, and you could probably identify that a lot of them would kind of benefit from that extra bit of height and that extra bit of reach in their legs and arms. And more so maybe for sports like 100-meter sprinting, sport and cycling, for example, that you really need those physiological and physical qualities to be able to perform at a level. So you need to have those genetic qualities within, and then have the opportunity to train and to have the opportunity to go and excel in the sport. So I think they're not mutually exclusive. I think one doesn't function without the other. You could have a very, to use the word talented in terms of genetic gifts a young person might have, but they're in a club that's not associated with anything. They're just training away, doing their thing, and that's fine. So there's no opportunity for that potential talent to be tapped into, to be trained, and to be given the opportunities to perform on the international stage. But you're right in terms of talent identification, which is it's a very subjective matter, especially when you're dealing with kids who haven't reached any point of maturation, and you're trying to predict whether they're going to be tall, small, wide, whether they're going to be able to do certain, carry out certain physical tasks. You just don't know. And, talent identification really, it boils down to, or it relies on the subjectivity of the identifier. So it's really, really hard to put your finger on it and say, look, that kid's going to be good at such a sport, because by the time they get to 14, it might be a stage where they're like, I'm done here, finished, I'm bored, I'm going out with somebody, I'm going to, I have a different interest, and then I'm gone. So I think research will show that the amount of people that come through those kind of formal talent identification systems, the percentage of those kids that go on to perform or even participate in sport later in life is actually quite small.
They have a interesting bit of a stat on it, which is that in countries that, or in organizations that espouse talent identification and use it, 100% of the people who make it to the top come through the talent identification protocols. But it's bad science. It's like, if you only allow it to work that way, that's the way it's going to work. So the example that you'd always give is like, you go to the American sports where you say, well, we pick our college athletes from the high schools, we pick our pros from the college system. So if you don't get into the system through that, talent identification selection process, you don't get to go. So if you happen to not develop as a basketball player until you're 19 and you're already in college, well, the chances are you're not making that college team, and you're not ever going to get an NBA scholarship or an NBA pick. But, it's in other countries then where it's just, or systems where it's wide open. You hear all of these stories of people who move into sports later in life and change and adapt.
Absolutely.
And my greatest examples of that, it's again a different type of talent ID in its own way, but it's still good for the story. You look at the UK in the last couple of Olympics, where they've picked people from different sports and helped them to transition, because they were fed up of training for high performance in a particular sport, but they weren't fed up of the environment, or that they still had
they needed a new challenge as such.
And you see people going from like road cycling to sitting in a boat rowing. And
even Taekwondo as well. They're getting guys in WAKO. I look at Tony and people like that, and
it's incredible that
absolutely. And I think there was a little story I read about in Australia, I think a number of years back, because they had no environment to train for the Winter Olympics. So what they did was they got a load of gymnasts who weren't actually excelling in gymnastics and took them into a program to train them to be I don't even know the name of the sport. They come down the slope and they go off the edge on the skis, and they do the tumble and then land on the skis. So they taught them how to do that. So they had the basic skills for the ability to tumble and land. So they taught them then how to they sent them away, I think, to Austria to be trained up. And I think after maybe 2 Olympic cycles, they landed their first medal within the Winter Olympics. So it's interesting. But I mean, just to go back to the point that Adrian was making in relation to talent identification, one of the big problems, and that's what you were talking about there, Adrian, was that exclusion error. So kids aren't being selected because they may not be tall enough, or they may not be fast enough, and that brings into the whole conversation about the relative age effect. But that one of the big problems with talent identification is that maturation is often confused for ability. So I suppose an example in relation to that would be rugby. Say an under-13s rugby team. The coach is going to want their biggest, tallest, strongest players on the rugby team. So that means that possibly a kid, and if maybe tap into the relative age effect, a kid who's been born in the first quarter of the year versus a kid who's been born in the last quarter of the year has that little bit of advantage in terms of that extra maturation or that extra physical development. So they're always going to be picked for the teams, but Adrian was pointed out that kind of levels itself off when they reach adulthood. And in fact, the kids that were deselected at the time and maintained their activity within sport went on to develop resilience, went on to develop grit, went on to have to develop lateral thinking in order to survive in sport. And they actually became the better players when they reached adulthood, because the guy that was, when they were 12 or 13, 14 or 15, all he did was run through players, didn't have to learn how to move laterally, probably never sidestepped in his life until he was 18 or 19. So
not
it's
much
interesting.
Struggle there for them.
No, it's interesting. So as coaches, I think we're constantly juggling this in relation to kids in sport, and that whole area of talent identification, especially with children in sport, then kind of it brings in the problem of early specialization and what we do with them. So I suppose technically we shouldn't be selecting or identifying a child that's under 16, because you just don't know where they're going to be after 16 years of age. You're missing all of that physical maturation at 12 and 13, and it's very, very hard to predict where they're going to be, whether they have that home support, Adrian, that you were talking about, whether they've got the motivation, the commitment and opportunities. So it's nearly unfair to put your finger on a kid at 11 years of age and say, you've got what it takes. You don't know. It's impossible to know.
Especially in the combat sports where they are late specialization sports in terms of, like, look at things like gymnastics and that, and if you haven't made it by a certain age, like, chances are you're gone and you're not going to make the Olympics or whatever. But for us, like, it is about hitting that peak when you become senior, and that's a long road, especially for kids who start so young. There's like, as you said, there's a good chance that a lot of them don't even make it to that far.
Yeah, 100%. And to be honest with you, I think combat sport is not learning from other international sports, and certain elements of combat sports. I'm not going to say them all, because some combat sports have their head around early specialization. Well, a lot of them don't. And a classic example of that is, unfortunately, like, WAKO now have World and European Championships for children. So 7, 8, 9, 10-year-olds are now competing on the international stage for international medals. And that has a negative knock-on effect to how children are going to be coached. And it influences the culture of a national federation, and that national federation influences the culture of clubs, and within the clubs then coach behaviours are negatively impacted, because now the children are training specifically to be performers. And the science tells us in abundance that early specialisation for children has negative effects. Now, within that, you do have your early specialisation sports, such as you mentioned, Richie, there, gymnastics, figure skating might be another one off the top of my head. Diving, yeah. So, I mean, they're early specialization because the performance needed is needed within a young person's body. So the ability to do gymnastics, you have to be relatively young. And in some cases, the injuries that can be, that can happen to an athlete can prevent them from competing or performing when they're older. So there's logic behind some sports being early specialization. But combat sport, I mean, to be in our physical and mental peak, we're well into our 20s in order to, to have that ability to perform within combat. But that's all being changed, unfortunately. And now we've got children who are training specifically to perform on the world stage, and it's not fair. It's not fair on children, and it's not fair on coaches. And why is it not fair? I think it's because, as sports coaches, we have a responsibility for children that come into our clubs, and that responsibility lies around setting up that child for life. So we should be teaching them physical literacy skills, general movement ability, as opposed to sport-specific demands that are required in order for them to compete. So it's happening, unfortunately. It's happening, and the culture of international sport is dictating the pace of early specialization, and I think combat sports is going to suffer because of it. These are not development stages for, there's not a chance that an 8-year-old competing right now to be at the European Championship is going to be competing with their 20. I put my house on it. So it's not development. You're not bringing kids through a process or a pathway. There's only and can be only negative effects to all of that in terms of burnout, psychological pressure, injuries, and all of that, I think, is created by a multifactorial environment that involves, as I said, the international federation, the national federation, the club and coach behaviours. But then also you've got parents who are supporting this, okay? And they're supporting it maybe without even understanding the negative consequences of it. So you've got all of these adult kind of aspects, and in the middle of it, you've got this 10-year-old who is now developing the identity that they're going to be a world or European champion. And it boils my blood sometimes to see some of the things on social media, 7-year-olds being declared as world champions. And I've seen it, 7 years of age, world champion. What is that telling that child? You know, what is that telling? It's setting them up for failure. And if you've studied anything that Carol Dweck has done in terms of how you communicate or feedback to the child, you know, we're telling this child that they're already made it at 7 years of age. Now, maturation kicks in at 14, 15 or 16. Peak height velocity doesn't go the way they wanted it to go. And all of a sudden, they're not winning. But they've developed this identity over many years that they're talented. And now they're not winning. And excuses. And I've had personal experiences of coaching children. And when I say children, I'm talking about maybe early teenage years. And they come from an environment where early specialization is to the fore. And these are the children that tend to be injured a lot more, or perceived injury a lot more, because it's much easier to say that I pulled a hamstring or my back went than it is to tell the parent or the coach that I lost. It's easier to do that. Now, for me, that's a silent cry for help. That is not where a child should be at any age, saying that my shoulder fell out or I pulled a ligament because I got beaten. And these are the excuses that you see, and they're a telltale sign. And I think if you're around sports coaching for long enough, you get to identify these little signals that that come from juniors. But it's all wrong. It's all negative. And the follow on from that is that you've got kids developing social media profiles and personalities. You've got 8-year-olds saying that they're sponsored athletes and stuff like that. So where is it going? Where are we going? We won't see the effect of all of that for many years to come. And in particular, I'm not sure what it's like within ITF, but in kickboxing, especially within Ireland, the transition from junior to senior is not a transition at all. In fact, it's probably that gap that we lose most of our athletes. So the transition into senior, the senior team is nearly decimated at this stage. You could hazard a guess without any research being done on it to say that it's because of that early specialization. Most of the seniors that came through the system as early specializers. So who knows?
It's interesting there that you say as well about people not wanting to disappoint parents and things, because I would imagine that a lot of that pressure is coming from there, and from parents being a little bit insecure and trying to live their lives through their children again, and wanting their children to be world champions so they can be posting it on Facebook and my son is great and all this stuff. And because you wonder where that comes from, a 7 or an 8-year-old, because unless they are put in that position by someone else, they aren't aware of being a world champion at that age. So you kind of have to take a step back and look at where that influence is coming. And I think it comes down to the coaches and the parents there as well, big time.
Yeah, absolutely. I think they all kind of synergize to create that environment where early specialization is to the fore. And some parents, you're right. I mean, what do they call helicopter parents? Is it? They're always hovering around. They're always making sure that the kid is getting the special treatment and all of that. But many parents are oblivious to it because it might, that information might not be easily accessible for them. There's lots of evidence out there to say that kids specializing in especially specializing in one particular sport, just miss out on all of that early development, that developmental training that gives them the confidence and the confidence to be engaged in sport across the span of their own lifetime, and as I said earlier, us as sports coaches engaging with children, that needs to be our priority, while we're also hopefully developing a love for our particular sport in them so they stay at it. But we've got a massive responsibility to ensure that the kid is equipped for life in terms of physical movement, physical literacy and competence in that area.
So you need to remove the ego there big time, because the coach doing it for themselves rather than for the kid, and then at the same time with the parents, it comes down to a little bit of ego there. And then when you talk about like Carol Dweck and all that, obviously she's done a lot of work on that, and the whole idea on building that growth mindset as opposed to anything else. And it makes sense because like when you look at this, and like at the moment we're doing a little bit of work on the mental side of it, and all of that comes up in abundance as well, you know what I mean? The whole idea of people going out there and feeling this pressure and they have to perform. And I mean, at the end of the day, like especially in ITF, the sport is a hobby as such, and yet people are feeling real intense pressure and have to perform life and death situation. And then you got the whole thing of people tying their self-worth to that and everything like that. You know, there's not much to be good to be coming from it, really, to be honest.
No, absolutely. You're dead right, Richie, especially in relation to that self-worth. And if it all doesn't work out in the end, like I said, what happens then? And, you know, there's been an amount of research done on kids that have come through that process, and who have gone on to have identity crisis and, you know, all sorts of disorders and just trying to find themselves. And I think the poster boy for that kind of early specialization is Tiger Woods.
Yeah,
you know,
always.
He's
Serena and Venus Williams, Tiger Woods, and
there you go. Yeah, you know, so I mean, Tiger Woods in particular, like striking the ball or driving the ball off a tee at 2 years of age, became very, you know, physically very adept at golf, but mentally, you know, I think that all played out. Unfortunately for him, all played out in the public eye. And just total lack of you know, the ability to deal or coping strategies to deal with personal problems and stuff. Without going too much into the detail of it, it's been well covered in books. But unfortunately, he's used as the poster boy for early specialization. But he's probably less than 1% of the population of kids that go through sport that made it at a high level. And you could even argue whether he made it. I mean, if money is your thing, well then he made it. But you could argue whether he did or not.
The simplest way, and I always talk about this when we're on a coaching course, whatever, one of the simplest ways that I explain it to people is like, okay, and usually I often talking to people who are in their 30s and 40s because they have some experience in the sport they're looking at coaching. Say, okay, is there anything that you're in your life that you've done for 10 years and you've managed to sustain an equal intensity and passion around that for 10 solid years? Anyone who's married for 10 years, throw your hand up there, you know. Do you have the same intensity and passion for that you did 10 years ago, you know? How about
be careful of your answer now. Be careful of your answer.
Yeah, you have to be careful here. You know, how about your car? Are you as passionate about that car that you bought, you know, 10 years later when the loan is well paid, you know?
Yeah.
And it's such an odd thing to expect that. And if you talk about an 8-year-old potentially going to the international, whatever, about a world championships, or going to the international championships, they imagine at 28 years of age that they're going to have, you know, still wanting to get up in the morning and the first thing they want to do is go and get the gloves on and do a bit of work or whatever. There's so little in life that you're going to sustain that you're going to look for something that's more interesting. You know, you're going to look for something else that tickles that itch. I mean, we talked about the gymnasts and the, you know, early specialization. I do a lot of work with Gymnastics Ireland, but you know, for the very, very few who get past 16 years of age, and it's very few, like minuscule numbers, it's the ones who coach for them. And like the nth of 1% who are on a high performance panel training full time. We're talking, you know, 10, 12 people in the country max. And then you have the, you know, the ones who are part-time coach, part-time athlete, and maybe one of the easier, so they may not be on an Olympic cycle, but they might be in, you know, in tumbling, or they might be in one of the other, you know, the less well-known disciplines that isn't going to be there in the Olympic Games. They might have a chance at a world championship spot or something. And you know, it's so rare because they've been on that track from 9 years of age, 8 years of age, 20 hours plus a week of training. You know, you're just going to get to a point where, you know, we talk about there's a certain amount of competence is required, you know, and you want to see an increase in competence all the time to get fire enthusiasm, get you confident. But when you're invested to that level in a sport for that long, like, the beginner goals gains are long gone. Like, you're talking about incremental, and you're probably seeing setbacks as often as you're seeing steps forward.
Absolutely, yeah.
So the motivation is crushingly difficult to find sometimes, you know.
You can even see that in our own ITF, Adrian. Like, look at the finalists. Well, not even the finalists. The winners of the Euros and the Worlds in the last few years have all been people, I would say, under 24, majority anyway.
Yeah. Once you're on the fighting side of it, like, I mean, that's why Hong stood out so much in winning that Euros, you know, his last Euros there. You know, you'd almost say it was a freak event, but he was in the final against Ian, and Ian's what, 23, 4?
Yeah.
Might be a little older now, but like, you know,
generally though, they're all quite
20s.
young, like, early 20s,
Yeah.
And I don't know whether that plays into it, and maybe there's just a new era coming through, but the more and more I can see it, it's like young guys coming through, and then they just fall off bit by bit by bit. And I was only talking, I won't mention who it was, but I was only talking to somebody who won the Worlds in Ireland in individual sparring the other day, and he's now packed in Taekwondo, you know, and he's only same age as me, around 20, 26, 27. And he won the Worlds in 2017, and that's it, he's done. And you wonder, it's probably because like he's probably slogging and living it all his life through that for a long time. That was one of the reasons why I packed it in myself as well. I was just doing it for competing internationally.
Yeah, you need new challenges, don't you? Like we're a species that enjoys variety, you know, and it's a good point there actually. When you talk about the person that won the 2017 Worlds going off to do other things, and if you look at the amount of people who had come through the kickboxing pathway are now trying to establish themselves in MMA. So while they're still involved in a combat sport, they're not still involved in kickboxing. They're going off for new challenges because they've been doing this for so long, and that's understandable. But when you reverse that right back to an 8-year-old doing it, well then surely they're going to be gone by the time they're 14 at least. You know, so what does that say for the future of the sport? Time will tell.
Yeah. That's an interesting one.
Once upon a time,
when you bring them in,
like I remember starting up classes in 2001, maybe 2002. No, I would actually go back and say it was 2000, 2001. I started teaching 4, 5, and 6-year-olds. And back at that stage, there was, I think, pretty much me and Master Cooley. And I don't know if there was anyone else who was teaching kids that age at the time. Certainly none of the mainstream sports were. Gymnastics were, of course, swimming and a couple of others, but like the early specialization, but most of the mainstream sports, not the field sports certainly weren't. And the entire focus of that was simply physical literacy, physical development, a little bit of socialization skills, and away we go, which is not really too distant from the roots of most of the Tigers, Cubs, Ninjas, Warriors, whatever you want to call them, programs. The problem that I had at the time was parents were not seeing what they wanted to see. They expected to see them kicking and punching and doing,
kicking,
you know, whatever. And it's like, it's not the time for them. This is what they actually need right now. And I, about 6 years in, and it was a difficult decision because I had nearly 200 people in the club at the time. I stopped coaching them, and we dropped off 60 people, give or take, right away, you know, over the next year or two. But what had started to happen was I wasn't getting into 10, 11, 12-year-olds anymore. And I was getting to the point where there was no 10, 11, 12s because they'd all trained younger. And the ones that were now 10, 11, 12, for the most part, were gone because they'd already done 6, 8 years. And, you know, when you're thinking about it, it's like if you were looking at this as a purely commercial activity, if you have a customer who has a repeat business and the average term of their investment is 3 to 4 years, well, then you need to get 25% new people every year to maintain your throughput, your turnover. But in our case, it's not, well, for me at least, it's not a business. That's not what it's about. So the who you have matters as much as I have X number of people. It matters who those people are. It matters what demographic they fill. It matters where they're at in terms of development and where they are in their Taekwondo, and all of that stuff matters. And since then, more and more martial arts have gone into that area and have 30, 40, 50% of their members in that space. And all of mainstream sport has moved in there. In some cases through the vehicle of physical literacy or, you know, multi-sport models or whatever, you know, basically substituting what should be happening in school and at the home and in free play, but isn't. And we've got a whole new system. Like I could definitely say there are Taekwondo clubs that haven't produced an adult in 10 years. You know,
adults are increasingly harder to get. 100%.
But adults aren't going to come to a club populated by children, and in particular when the only people they meet who are their age have 15 years experience.
Exactly.
You know, that's a tough ask, because I mean,
it is.
You know, Richie's popped along to the jiu-jitsu club and he can find guys who have the same level of experience as him or a little more. Now, if everyone you go to roll with is 15 years of experience in jiu-jitsu and you're a ragdoll, you know, you ain't going to enjoy that so much.
100%.
And, you know, I mean, that's a huge thing that adults have told me in the years. Like, you know, they can step in the ring with Jamie and Jamie won't hurt them because he's enough experience, but they can only hit him if he lets them. And that's frustrating.
Yeah, it's not a level playing field at all.
No, you're a grown man at 30 years of age, and you're strong, and you're fit, and you're physically active, and you can't touch this, at the time, say 18, 19-year-old skinny little kid. But you can't touch him unless he wants you to. That's not a great place to start. So
it's disheartening. Yeah, it is disheartening. Yeah, and a lot of them adults then end up going into boot camps and joining gym programs, and which is great. At least they're staying active, but the sport obviously suffers.
Sure.
Yeah, it's unfortunate. We were talking earlier about when we were just mentioning early specialization. I think, Adrian, you mentioned that 10 years, and I don't know if you were tapping into that 10,000 hour rule or the 10-year rule in order to be
planted in there subliminally.
Yeah, well, it worked. The whole concept of deliberate practice, I think, is an interesting area that's worth a chat. And how it ties into early specialization, and how even early specialization might actually lend to the whole 10,000 hour myth, I suppose. It'd be safe enough to call it that now at the moment, or the that length of time that it needs for somebody to become an expert or a master at a certain activity. I think it's an interesting concept, and I'd be interested to hear your own views on that.
Yeah, I mean, certainly, I've been guilty of putting in references to it in places, I would say, in coaching course and all the rest of it. But I've done it, maybe to kind of explain the fallacy of it as well. So, I mean, one of the tasks that we did was like, okay, how often does someone train per week when they're when they're, say, 1 year in, 2 years in, 4 years in, 6 years into their martial arts practice?
Yeah.
And let's say they start at 8, and by the time they turn 18, 20 years of age, where are they at? And usually they end up with somewhere around 500 hours, 600, 700, 1,000 hours for someone who's doing pretty well. And what you always end up with is like, well, maybe that person has been, on the national team, they have a black belt, they've done whatever. Maybe they've done none of those things, but they're still, if they continue at the same rate, about 80 years from achieving mastery.
Yeah.
Which obviously you're on a slope, so it's going, you're on diminishing returns after a while. So when you point out the math of that and what it would require and how early you would have to start, the simple question you ask anyone is, look, is that realistic for anyone within our sport to do that? The answer is very quickly no. And then you ask the second question, which is, well, what's mastery anyway? And do we have any numbers within our martial art or our sport that says, this is world class, this level of performance is world class? We recognize it when we see it. But even when you look at how many people attend the world championships, are they all world class? Well, by definition, they're there, but they're there because they're the best in their pond, their pool. Usually a third, a half of the field at most are world class. So if we had and I say that when it comes to senior, juniors, you've got other possibilities entirely. So what's world class? I mean, it's
it's hard to put a measurement on anything like that, really.
Yeah.
And I was doing the math just before we came on here, and I was I think it was over 12 years at 2 hours a day training equated to about 8,500 hours. So that'll give you an idea, as again, just to go back to the fallacy of the 10,000 hour rule. But even separate to the fact that it's not accurate, there's a whole lot of negative connotations attached to it, and it gives the wrong kind of idea to a person. Again, I suppose it encourages that early specialization to be just focused on one particular sport for as long as you can, to get better at it, and it completely negates all of those psychological characteristics that are needed to be able to perform on the international stage or even the national stage. And it's interesting, the original piece of work that was done, that where the 10,000 hour rule came from, was a piece of work that was done, I don't know if you're familiar with it, a piece of work that was done in 1993 by a psychologist called Anders Ericsson, who did this study in relation to deliberate practice. And the study was conducted in Berlin over musicians. I think they were violinists, actually.
Violinists, yeah.
Yeah, violinists. And the results of the study showed that when an expert music teacher broke the students down into 3 categories, that would be novice, intermediate, and expert level, the students were asked to kind of think back, very subjective, think back how many hours practice would you have done through the time that you started up to where you are now, and try and add that all together. So room for error, massive room for error in all of that. But what was critically missing from the piece of research was the fact that there was no variance given. There was no statistical analysis applied to the numbers. But what happened subsequently to that, and there was nothing wrong with the research, and he was never trying to sell that 10,000 hours as a product, but journalists jumped on the back of it, and outliers came around, and Matthew Syed's bounce came around, which really challenged the whole thing around, well, you don't need to have any talent to be good at something. You just need to practice. And this was dangerous for people. It's dangerous for people who are going to engage in this type of activity for so many hours, for so long across their lives, with this promise that you're going to reach some sort of, expert level. And I suppose it's true within certain tasks or certain disciplines, such as learning to play a musical instrument, or, for example, learning how to play chess, where the parameters of the task are kind of constrained. There's an upper limit and there's a lower limit in terms of there's only so many chords you can learn on a guitar. Then you have to learn how to put them all together and make a song. There's only so many movement patterns in the game of chess, and this is why masters of chess understand every single movement pattern right from the first move. So the deliberate practice model, and in relation to spending hours and hours and hours at trying to perform something or perfect something, has relevancy to those particular tasks. But when you try and fit all of that into the chaos of what is sports performance, so obviously now you're looking at competing against another person or other people or the environment, and there's so many variables that are in there that really kick that whole 10,000 hour rule out the window. So it's really interesting. But and a lot of, I know myself and Richie do have kind of conversations back and forth around pad work and where that fits in, and the fact that pad work has become for one reason or another kind of this predictor of performance. So if you're able to do all of these classy moves really fast, moving your head, dropping your shoulder, that it's in some way infers that you're very good at competing on the mats. It can't be. It can't be, because that particular context that you're operating in doesn't have the chaos. It doesn't have the decision making. Somebody's making the decision.
Driving a car park.
100%.
And then you go onto the motorway and you crash into a car.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. And you don't have to look over your shoulder or whatever.
Someone asks you to reverse out of your parents' driveway in the dark with the lights off.
Yeah.
It's simple and slow, but easy to get wrong.
Yeah.
Do when it comes to the 10,000 hour thing, like I remember even when I read about this first back in late 90s, I suppose it was. I don't think I'd heard of Malcolm Gladwell hadn't come along yet, so we were reading. It was Kay Anders Ericsson stuff, in journal form, as handed down by PJ Smith or somebody along those lines in University of Limerick. But one of the things that jumped out at me then and still jumps out at me now was that it required a discrete skill that doesn't overlap into other realms, and it required. So, for example, it didn't take into account that, you're learning about, let's take the Bill Gates example from Outliers, right? So he's working as computer programming, but it doesn't explain where he picked up his business acumen. It doesn't explain where he picked up his socialization skills that allowed him to make a partnership with Steve Ballmer and the various people that were involved in it. Or the social quirks that meant that he wouldn't fit in other areas and get distracted with a girlfriend and whatever else it happens to be. There's so many variables that go into that one of the variables is he certainly wouldn't have done it if he didn't have access to a computer and a mainframe and all the rest of it when nobody else did. But there are so many other things, and as you said, your deliberate practice doesn't then take into account how well you rest, how well you feed yourself, how you're getting on with your family, what's the chaos at home, how long a drive is it to your training. And, it just doesn't take those things into account, and how you use that time. There's so many things with it. And it's just one of those things where it's like, I like to take away from that only one thing, which is that not all practice is equal. That's the part I like to take away from that, which is, what really counts is your deliberate practice, your genuinely focused attempts to improve have far more weight than your turning up and see what happens sessions.
As well as everybody's journey is quite unique as well, of course. There's not two people that are the same, or like we talked about this morning, Adrian, about like people having like quirks and things like that, but that actually can be quite effective when it comes to combat sport and things that are such dynamic and chaotic, like we said earlier. You know what I mean? Those things can be actually quite useful if you know what I mean. So there's so many variables and things like that.
Are they like little personal quirks that a person might have that gets them over certain hurdles or psychological barriers, that type of thing?
But even like quirks like being awkward in terms of your technique, that it's not considered perfect technique and things like that.
You know, classic is being a southpaw.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
And we only spoke about this morning, John, and we were just saying that like the whole idea of chunking and all this information together in the brain, because you're not used to seeing that, then the perception is a little bit different when you come up against somebody who
100%, yeah.
We say like unusual or whatever, but that's a massive advantage for that person, like, you know what I mean?
Yeah. It's a great point. I used to have a student a number of years back who was so tight around the hips because they came from a field sport. They did no mobility work. It was all about linear speed. And he just couldn't lift a side kick, just couldn't do it without the knee being pointed towards the ground. But my God, he had the fastest switch back kick you could ever imagine and he just had it because of that quirkiness of his hips, the tightness of his hips just put his legs into that position, and because of his elasticity, he was able to do it like in the blink of an eye. So yeah, it kind of highlights that kind of what you're talking about there in terms of those quirkiness or different attributes that people have.
On the 10,000 hour rule, actually, I think there was I don't know if any of you know about this, but there was a project that was going on for a while about this golfer guy who read Malcolm Gladwell's book or whatever.
Yeah.
And he wanted to go about that project, but I don't know the story, but all I know is that he actually didn't go ahead with it. He got so far and then he stopped.
Yeah, he dropped off. Yeah,
it's interesting just that we were saying that earlier of like not actually making it that far in the first place.
Yeah, exactly. You know, there's another great example in terms of the deliberate practice rule, or the model, where they got an expert mathematician in and they got a layperson off the street, and the task was to try and remember a sequence of numbers, as many sequences of numbers as possible, and to be able to recite them. And the guy that walked in off the street was able to memorize maybe up to 37 or 38 in terms of the sequence, but the expert mathematician could only get as far as 17. And they were trying to make something of that look what deliberate practice can do. But the elephant in the room was like, it didn't make him a better mathematician.
Yeah.
So when it came to the actual study of maths, the expert obviously blew the other guy away, and that the ability to recall sequences of numbers had absolutely no impact or no influence on whether you're a good mathematician or not. So you could take anything in relation to deliberate practice and then apply it to the performance of numbers in this case. Now, I think deliberate practice has a place. I think it's good for technique development. Obviously, you're not going to spend 10,000 hours trying to develop a side kick, but certainly in relation to just kind of technique isolation. And I think this is one of the great things about pad work, because it gives a coach a very specific vantage point in terms of feedback and observation of what your fighter or what your athlete is doing right in front of you. You can feel it, you can see it, you can see their facial expressions. You might be wanting to tidy up a straight right hand or a lead hook or a jab or something, and it gives you that very kind of unique vantage point to offer feedback and feel the technique out. So I think pad work does have a place, and it obviously has a lot of advantages, but it's
living there is the problem.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, 100%.
I know we were back and forth a few times about this, but it's that idea of bridging the gap. I think is where people miss it a lot. You know, bridging that gap between the pad work or whatever your non-deliberate practice.
And then putting it into some sort of and then obviously developing the skill within the scenario. So in that comes your constraints-led approach to coaching and stuff like that. You know,
the degrees of freedom. It's how variable, how representative, and they're dials that you play with.
Absolutely, without getting too fixated on them. Have we solved the world's problems yet? Do you know?
We're on the way.
Are we good?
we have time anyway. We have time.
Poverty is next.
The problem until you understand the problem. That's
that's true. Well, we could be here for a bit longer, so.
Well, that's it.
Yeah.
But I suppose, one to leave with on that 10,000 hour rule thing is just, it's always a reminder to people that the guy who wrote the study never called it a rule. He didn't even refer to it. It was just.
That's very true. Yeah, that's very true. And in fact, the research was actually quite interesting. It was just some people jumped on it and said, well, here's something I can capitalize on. And Syed has taken a lot of flack over that because of bounce. And then obviously other books were written to counter bounce. One of them being, what's David Epstein's book called? The Talent Code?
Talent Equation.
Talent
I
I think it's
Talent
talent
Code.
it is actually, no,
Yeah,
the Talent
talent
Equation is the podcast.
That's the
Talent
Yeah,
podcast.
that's right. Yeah. And I think he's
the,
written. I haven't read the recent book now. He's written about range, which is kind of, from what I know, I haven't read it. It looks at the success of people who had a different range of experiences as opposed to specializing.
I had a
Richie,
look at
there
that
you go.
on
We've got the topic for our next series of videos and podcasts. We're going to do a weekly book review.
That's a great idea.
Today is World Book Day, lads.
Yeah.
Or was it yesterday? Maybe it was yesterday or today. It's one or the other.
I have no idea, man. I have no idea. I've forgotten whether today's Monday or Friday, to be honest with you.
We'll update the goal, read an extra 250 pages this week, you know?
There's a good app, actually, lads. It's called Blinkist. And at the moment, because of the lockdown, it's free for the month or whatever. And that was actually one of the books that I was just flicking through, and I didn't get to it yet. But basically, it sums the book up into like 10 quick pages or a 15-minute audio book. And it's actually good. And there's lots of books like that, and sport books that are on it for coaching for anybody who's interested that's listening during the lockdown and stuff. So
it's a good idea. Yeah, Blinkly. You obviously get a free trial with it or something, Richie, do you?
Yeah, because I think like a promotion because of the coronavirus, I think they're giving like the premium version for the month of April or May or whatever for free. So it might be worth looking if you're into that stuff. Yeah.
Sounds good. Yeah. How much time have we got left?
As much as you want.
Yeah.
I have a question for Adrian while he's here.
Hey, there's a reverse. Look, we've just swapped seats.
Why not? Just in terms of your own profession and your role in coach education, Adrian, where do you see coaching going at the moment? And how has it progressed from the very early days of coaching just really being about communication and relationships with people? And now you've got the elements of coaching science starting to become much more relevant, and how that joins up the art of coaching and the science of coaching, and how does formal coach education bridge the gap, or should it?
Yeah, so I mean, the things that are changing, I suppose, the big things that are changing is, first of all, sport, certainly until the outbreak of this coronavirus thing, but I think this will resume anyway, but sport has become so commercially viable in so many sectors that the education sector has also latched onto sport, but even more so than sport is wellness, fitness, physical activity. In fact, the biggest thing and the single biggest change for me in my work is that somebody between the various sports ministries around Europe got together and decided that, no, do you know what we're going to do? We're going to have a new definition for what sport is. So they changed the European definition of sport, and so all of the member nations are, subscribing to this new definition. And like many things, you make that one little change somewhere, and now all policy follows that, all of the money follows that, and then all the practice follows the money. So what I'm seeing, and I think what the big impact is, things have moved away from sport being about performance and about being about setting example of what was possible, to sport being now about recognizing all physical activity and human endeavor almost as that's sport. And it's all about making us better human beings by making us more well adapted, more psychologically stable, more healthy, and it's going that direction. And so I don't think that has had a profound impact on coach education specifically yet, but it's coming. But it has had a huge impact on the third level education program. So where you had a lot of exercise and sports science, they're now becoming exercise and health science, and sport is getting dropped. You're having degree programs in coaching, but they're now more specific. They're, it's strength and conditioning, it's sports performance, it's, you're getting niched in there. I think some of the other key changes are, previously we had increasing levels of coaching expertise linked with an increasing level of athlete expertise and also age. So expertise linked to age and also linked to coaching level. And I think that's been blown up. So what we've now got is recognizing that, hey, your youngest or least experienced person needs the best coach they can get, who is interested in and focused on making them better in their environment, situation, and basically meeting them where they're at. Yes, that will need interpersonal skills that are appropriate to the environment and the relationship, but it's also going to need the right technical knowledge in terms of the sport, and it's also going to need the right sports side, knowledge as well. I don't think that the correct route is for all coaches to become fully fledged sports scientists, etc. The more you try to be a master of all trades, the more you become, almost irrelevant at doing your core job. But you have to have, I think, in this day and age, the higher you go up the levels of performance, the more you need to have at least a grounding so that you can have the conversations, and so that you can know when the person who's coming out to work with your team of individuals who is an S&C specialist isn't talking through their arse and actually knows your sport, what your athletes need, etc. And also so that you can, there's an awful tendency among coaches to feel like their knowledge is inferior or worth less than the knowledge of the person who's come out of university with a degree in something. When in reality, it's experiential knowledge versus, academic knowledge. And, the two aren't, always equatable, but, you have something in your relationship with that athlete, your experience, your knowledge that they don't have. But there's a tendency, I think, for athletes now to go, oh, well, I'll do my 8 gym sessions a week and my 2 Taekwondo sessions. Like, sorry, you've got that backwards. Like that person's there to help support the athlete in their role as a Taekwondo athlete in our example. And you're there to help that athlete filter the information that external expert is giving, and to help filter the sport specific information back in a way that the expert can use to sharpen their toolbox.
Exactly.
So I think a lot of the space that we're in now is moving to where we're having better bridges, better integrations between the spheres of knowledge and expertise, and the coach is learning how to work more as the interpreter between the athlete and the specialist. External.
Yeah. Which raises the question, maybe one for Richie, if the term expert coach even exists.
Personally, I don't think so. Do you know what's funny? I was just having a chat with the lads in the group chat there on Facebook about this while ago. I think that you need a combination of a lot of different things, and it comes down to personality and things like that as well. Like, not every coach is going to be like outgoing and willing, but at the same time, that doesn't suit every athlete. I think I personally don't think there's any perfect coach or anything like that anyway. It's definitely getting that balance between knowing what you're on about and also the art of it,
exactly.
And like for me, I have to say, like, it's been easy for me to come along and have all this information available that people are putting out there now, and there's like so much information that's available. But I would imagine, like, for you, when you guys were starting off, it would have been a lot more difficult, that you'd have to go really search for this stuff, and it was it's not the same, like, with social media, and like Twitter is like a hotbed for coaching and stuff like that. And there's great stuff out there now, but I don't think it was that easily accessible for you guys, I'd imagine, was it? Like podcasts and all that.
No, absolutely not. And Adrian's probably 10 years older than me, so it's worse for him.
At least, at least.
But no, you're right. I mean, social media has been great, and the work that you guys obviously is feeding into all of that. And now you can go on Instagram and Twitter, and you can get infographics of information from a number of different scientific papers, where in the past you would have had to know how to navigate a scientific paper to find the relevancy in it. You no longer need to do that. I think information is obviously much more accessible. But it reminds me of a conversation that I had while we were away competing internationally, and a peer of mine, another coach, we were pointing over. That's one of the Italian coaches, and the reference was made that he was a novice coach. He's only a novice coach, and I was like, what? Explain that definition to me, because he only works with the children. And I was like, if there was ever going to be an expert coach, to define an expert coach, it's the ones that are working with the children. As a high performance coach, as a performance coach, if you get handed an athlete that comes through a pathway, you're only polishing them up. You're only making little tweaks here or there to get them suitable for international competition. But the big work is being done by the guys that are working with the kids and the teenagers. Foundations, exactly. They're the real experts if you're going to define what an expert coach is. But I do agree. I think there's different, obviously there's different variations and knowledge as well across the entire spectrum of coaching, and that probably an expert coach doesn't actually exist. It's interesting.
Very relevant to the current times. You'll see that meme going around on Instagram and Facebook at the moment, where we've never realized just how much we value our truck drivers, our postman, our whatever else.
Our barbers, John.
Barbers.
Well.
The same reality is, like, it's a supply demand thing. If your developmental coaches aren't good enough, your high performance world doesn't exist.
It doesn't exist.
If you haven't got people who are willing to be the kind of people that high performance coaches need to be, and anyone who's done it for any stint in time knows that there's a lot of sacrifice, And you're sacrificing for people who are not going to reciprocate. That's one of the things in high performance. Like, as much as we love the guys who are on the team and all the rest of it, they are not, by virtue of what they're trying to do, they're not in a position to give back to you, or to give back to a club or give back to, like, it's just not, how that whole environment works.
Yeah.
So it's very energy draining. You give out a lot of energy to a very small number of people. You don't see much pushback from it. That's part of the nature of it. So I don't want to say that one is more valuable than another or anything like that, but it's recognizing that we all have our different roles to play, that none of that happens if we don't have, 10 times as many coaches who are really interested in just sharing what they love about their martial art and their enjoyment of it with as many people as they can. Keeping the doors open, keeping the people coming through and learning. It doesn't happen without any one niche coach. And really for us, it's just about, can we equip as many of them with the tools they need to do their job better, to have more enjoyment, less stress, doing their job. The whole, like, we absolutely steal that one from the Leaving Cert, the less stress, more success, again, that's what all of the study and the research is about, isn't it? It's about making better use of the time, making it easier to get good results for everybody, removing the heartbreak.
Exactly. Everybody wants the secrets and the secret sauce, the secret drill and all that. It doesn't exist, but at the same time, there are more efficient ways that you can get to that path by going through it all. And like, we won't say there's a right way and a wrong way, but there's obviously multiple paths to get to a destination. But there's a point that comes where you're saying, is this really efficient in getting to where I want to be? And I think that's where it's at, rather than looking for any secret or,
absolutely. That's the power of reflection. And just evaluating what you're doing. 100%.
I think if anything comes out of this period of isolation, that mentorship, that community of coaches, that shared experience part of it, if we can continue this beyond COVID-19, I think we will actually be in a stronger space as a sport going forward.
Yeah, absolutely. I agree. I hope you guys do, because this type of resource is badly needed. It's a credit to what you're doing, and it's quality content up until today. Anyway, it's been really great.
Just shining a light on all those bright flames out there who are doing good stuff in the dark.
Yeah, but it's great, and it's across discipline. It's really good. It's really good, and it's multinational as well. Obviously, we had Ursha on yesterday. So was it yesterday Ursha was on?
Yeah, it was.
Yeah, it's great. It's great. It bodes well for the future, I think. Let's keep the conversation going at some stage.
Absolutely. Yeah. Listen, it's been an absolute pleasure talking to you, and great to have you.
Thanks for having me on, guys. It was a pleasure to chat to you. Keep up the great work.
Yeah.
Appreciate it, John.
Talk to you soon. Always, lads. Take care. All the best. Good luck.